tons of stone that you can't even get a razor blade in between. Like, what the f was going on?
There is a question that has haunted serious researchers for over a century. Not the question of whether ancient Egyptians were brilliant. They were demonstrably, provably, on the record in the stone. The question is different. It is this: how far back does the brilliance actually go? Because here is what nobody in a textbook will say plainly. The monuments we attribute to ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the obelisks, the temples, represent the most astonishing act of sustained engineering in the history of our species. What they built with copper tools, wooden sledges, and human muscle was so precise, so massive, and so durable that it still humbles every engineer who examines it. That part of the story is real, documented, and extraordinary entirely on its own terms. But there is another monument sitting at the edge of the Giza Plateau that does not quite fit the story. It is 240 feet long. It weighs 200,000 tons. It was carved from a single piece of bedrock. It is the oldest, the largest, and in many ways the strangest monolithic sculpture on Earth. And the more rigorously you examine it, with geology, seismology, astronomy, and proportional analysis, the more the official explanation begins to fall apart. This is the story of both things at once. The real, remarkable, peer-reviewed science of how ancient Egyptians actually cut and moved stone. And the equally real, equally peer-reviewed scientific evidence that suggests the most famous monument in that stone landscape may be thousands of years older than we have been told. One story tells us what these people could do. The other story asks us who they were. Both stories are carved in the same granite. And stone does not lie. Before we can talk about who might have built the Sphinx and when, we need to understand the technology of ancient Egyptian stonework. Because the claims made about the Sphinx, that it could only have been built by a predecessor civilization, that its construction exceeds what ancient Egyptians were capable of, those claims depend entirely on underestimating what ancient Egyptians were actually capable of. And that underestimation is severe. In a quarry on the east bank of the Nile near the city of Aswan, there is a stone that never left the ground. It has been lying there for roughly 3,500 years, abandoned mid-cut, still attached at its base to the bedrock from which it was being slowly, painstakingly liberated. If finished, it would have been the largest obelisk ever erected in the ancient world. 42 meters tall. Nearly 1,200 tons of solid pink granite. A single piece of stone taller than a 12-story building. The workers who were carving it out of the bedrock encountered a crack deep in the granite, a natural flaw that made the stone structurally unsafe to move. So they stopped. They walked away. They left their tools scattered on the quarry floor. And in doing so, they left us something that the finished monuments of Egypt, however magnificent, cannot provide. They left us a frozen moment in the process. A snapshot of ancient engineering caught at the instant before completion, where the evidence of method is preserved and visible and real. The tool marks are still there. The channels they carved around the obelisk sides are still there. The thousands of round, dark gray stones they used to pound through some of the hardest rock on Earth are still there. Those round stones are called dolerite pounders, and they are the primary tool of Egyptian granite quarrying. Dolerite is a tough, fine-grained igneous rock, significantly harder than granite, denser, and more impact-resistant. Thousands of them have been found at Aswan, ranging from about 5 centimeters to 30 in diameter, worn round through use. And use is exactly the right word, because these were not tools pressed gently against granite. They were beaten against it again and again, in an action somewhere between pounding and throwing. Recent experimental archaeology put precise numbers to this process for the first time. Using close-range photogrammetry, a technique that creates three-dimensional models from photographs, researchers measured exactly how much granite was removed per hour of pounding with a dolerite stone. The result was approximately 216 cubic centimeters per hour, with a worker striking about 85 blows per minute. That is roughly the volume of a medium-sized coffee cup removed every hour by sustained manual pounding. Now do the math on the unfinished obelisk. It would have required removing approximately 900,000 cubic centimeters of granite from the channels around and beneath it. At 216 cubic centimeters per hour per worker, quarrying that single stone would have taken years of sustained labor by hundreds of workers operating simultaneously in shifts. And that is just the quarrying phase. Before the polishing. Before the transport. Before the raising. This is the scale of what the ancient Egyptians were doing. But the experimental results also raised a question that the physical evidence at the quarry itself seems to insist upon. The speed and volume of granite removal achieved by dolerite pounders alone does not fully account for the scale and variety of work preserved in the archaeological record. There are surfaces at Aswan that do not look like they were made by pounding. They look like they were sawed. There are channels with smooth, parallel walls and flat bases that would be extraordinarily difficult to produce through pounding alone. And then there are the drill cores. The drill cores are perhaps the single most debated pieces of physical evidence in the entire conversation about Egyptian stonework technology. Sir Flinders Petrie, the great 19th-century archaeologist and Egyptologist, collected them during his surveys in the 1880s. They now sit in the Petrie Museum at University College London. A drill core is the cylindrical plug of material left behind when a tubular drill, a hollow cylindrical tube used as a drill bit, bores through stone. What Petrie found on his granite cores, and what researchers have continued to analyze ever since, are spiral grooves running around the outside surface of the core like the thread of a screw, indicating the drill advanced through the stone at an extraordinary rate. The spiral groove on one of Petrie's granite cores advances approximately 2.5 millimeters per revolution of the drill. Modern diamond-tipped core drills cutting through granite advance at roughly 1/4 of a millimeter per revolution under optimal conditions. The ancient Egyptian drill core shows an advance rate roughly 10 times faster. And it achieved this through granite, without diamond tips, using tools whose exact composition is still not fully resolved. The most widely accepted explanation involves a tubular copper drill combined with a highly abrasive cutting medium, almost certainly quartz sand or emery. Emery is a naturally occurring mixture of corundum and other hard minerals with a hardness of around 9 on the Mohs scale, making it harder than both granite and quartz. The drill itself was probably a bow drill, a device where moving a bow back and forth rotates a shaft rapidly, transferring rotational energy to a cutting tool at the bottom. What the results suggest, and what functional analysis of drilled granite sarcophagus lids from the Old Kingdom has confirmed, is that a copper tube driven by a bow drill and charged with a hard abrasive slurry could produce the smooth, precise bore holes we see in Egyptian granite objects, given enough time, enough consistent pressure, and enough fresh abrasive continually fed into the cut. That phrase, given enough time, is important. The ancient Egyptians were not in a hurry in the way modern industrial civilization is in a hurry. The construction of a pyramid or a temple was not a project expected to be finished in months. It was a generational undertaking organized at the level of the state, drawing on a workforce organized in specialized teams, each responsible for specific stages of a process broken down with a precision that modern project managers would recognize. Then there is how they moved the stone. Ancient paintings and reliefs show granite colossi and large blocks being dragged on wooden sledges by teams of workers, with a figure at the front pouring liquid, almost certainly water, onto the surface being traversed. For decades, this figure was interpreted as a ritual gesture. Then in 2014, a Dutch research team ran the physics and tested the hypothesis experimentally. They discovered that wetting sand with precisely the right amount of water dramatically reduces the friction of dragging a heavy object across it. The capillary bridges formed between wet sand grains make the surface simultaneously stiffer and more slippery, cutting the pulling force required by roughly half. The figure in the painting was not performing a ritual. He was solving an engineering problem. Inside the Great Pyramid, the granite that forms the king's chamber speaks to a purpose beyond mere tomb construction. The chamber is built entirely from red Aswan granite. 50 massive blocks in the walls. 9 granite beams spanning the ceiling, each weighing between 25 and 80 tons. The blocks fit together with a tolerance measured in fractions of a millimeter. Not approximate millimeters, fractions. The joint faces were ground flat to a precision that our modern eyes can verify, but that our imaginations struggle to grasp when we think about the tools that achieved it. And the chamber has another property that was either a deliberate design feature or one of the most remarkable coincidences in architectural history. It resonates. When sound is produced inside the king's chamber, the granite surfaces reflect and amplify it with an intensity that acoustics researchers have described as extraordinary. The specific dimensions of the chamber combined with the acoustic properties of granite produce resonant frequencies that have been measured and documented. Whether this was intentional, whether the choice of granite for this specific chamber was partly driven by an understanding of its acoustic properties as well as its structural ones, is a question that has not yet been definitively answered. What is certain is that the architects chose granite where they did not have to. Limestone was abundant and far easier to work. The decision to transport hundreds of tons of granite from 900 kilometers away for the innermost chamber of the most important building ever constructed in ancient Egypt was deliberate, and the reasoning behind it was almost certainly more layered than simple practicality. What all of this evidence adds up to is not a mystery. It is a picture of a civilization that had developed, over centuries of accumulated practice, a comprehensive and sophisticated technology of granite working. Not a single secret technique, but an integrated system of methods, each suited to a different stage of the process, each refined through practical experience, each transmitted across generations of specialized craftsmen who understood not just what to do, but why it worked. The honest answer to the question of how ancient Egyptians cut granite is this: with dolerite pounders, copper instruments used with hard abrasives, controlled splitting techniques using water-soaked wooden wedges, progressive surface finishing using increasingly fine grinding compounds, and water-lubricated wooden sledges, all organized and applied at the scale of the Egyptian state by a trained workforce over time scales that modern thinking can barely accommodate. It does not require aliens. It does not require lost technology. It requires acknowledging that these were human beings who were better at this than we have given them credit for, and who achieved what they achieved not through magic, but through mastery. But now we need to look at the monument that sits at the center of a much harder question. Walk away from the quarry at Aswan. Travel north, 900 kilometers down the Nile to the Giza Plateau. Stand in front of the Great Sphinx at dawn, when the shadow is longest and the stone is cold and the light turns the limestone the color of old bone. Now look at it the way a geologist looks at it. Not with reverence. With evidence. The official story is clean and confident. Around 2500 BCE, during the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt, Pharaoh Khafra ordered workers to carve a massive guardian statue to watch over his pyramid complex. Using copper chisels, stone hammers, and wooden wedges, a team of laborers spent roughly 3 years shaping 200,000 tons of limestone into the largest monolithic sculpture on Earth. The result is 240 feet long and 66 feet high. The body of a lion. The head of a pharaoh wearing the royal headdress. It was originally painted red, yellow, and blue. A ceremonial cobra once sat on its forehead. A braided beard hung from its chin. Fragments of that beard are now in the British Museum. Case closed. Right. Except for this, there is not a single ancient Egyptian inscription anywhere that names the builder of the Sphinx. Not one. Not on the Sphinx. Not in any tomb. Not on any papyrus. The so-called dream stele, a granite tablet placed between the Sphinx's paws more than 1,000 years after it was supposedly built, contains a partial, damaged reference that might include the first syllable of Khafra's name. Even mainstream Egyptologist Salim Hassan admitted that the evidence connecting the Sphinx to Khafra is entirely circumstantial. The entire attribution is based on proximity to Khafra's pyramid and a facial resemblance that many researchers dispute. The most famous monument in human history. And nobody actually knows who built it. That gap in the record is not a small detail. It is the crack through which everything else begins to fall. In 1990, a geologist from Boston University named Robert Schoch traveled to Egypt. Schoch held a PhD in geology and geophysics from Yale. He was not an alternative researcher. He was not hunting for Atlantis. He was a mainstream academic who wanted to examine the Sphinx through a geologist's eyes. He assumed the conventional dating was correct. It took him seconds to see that something was wrong. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the pit carved from bedrock when the statue was originally shaped, display deep, smooth, undulating vertical erosion channels cutting into the limestone. Here is something simple enough to explain to anyone. There are 2 kinds of erosion and they look completely different. Wind and sand erosion create sharp, angular, horizontal grooves, like sandpaper dragged sideways across wood. Flat, jagged, horizontal lines. Water erosion from rainfall creates smooth, rounded vertical channels, like candle wax melting and dripping downward. Soft, flowing vertical curves. These 2 patterns are as different as a knife cut and a melted groove. Any geologist on Earth can tell them apart in seconds. The Sphinx enclosure shows the melted candle pattern. Water. Rainfall. Lots of it, over a very long time. The problem is simple and devastating. The Sahara has been a desert for roughly 5,000 years. Egypt receives almost no significant rainfall today, about 1 inch per year on the Giza Plateau. For the Sphinx to show this depth of water erosion, It had to have been exposed to sustained heavy rainfall over thousands of years before the desert arrived. Now look at nearby Old Kingdom structures definitively dated to around 2500 BCE, rock-cut tombs carved from the same general limestone formation. They show completely different erosion. The sandpaper pattern. Horizontal, sharp, wind and sand. Only the Sphinx and its enclosure show the melted candle pattern. If these structures were all built at the same time, they should all show the same type of weathering. They do not. Something about the Sphinx is fundamentally different from every other structure on the plateau. Critics have argued the difference could be explained by groundwater seeping up through the stone, or by moisture trapped in the sand that periodically buried the Sphinx. But the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure is heaviest at the top of the walls and on the western end, tapering off toward the east and the bottom. If groundwater or wet sand were the cause, the erosion should be heaviest at the bottom, where the water would pool. It is the opposite. The pattern is exactly what you would expect from rainwater falling on top of the monument and running downward. Additionally, the Sphinx temple, built from limestone blocks quarried directly out of the Sphinx enclosure, shows the same rainfall type weathering on its core stones. Those blocks were later refaced with Aswan granite during the Old Kingdom. Why would the pharaohs resurface a temple with expensive granite shipped from 500 miles upriver unless the original stone was already severely deteriorated? The granite refacing is evidence that the underlying limestone had been weathering for a very long time before the Old Kingdom pharaohs arrived. In 1991, shock and geophysicist Thomas DeBecke conducted seismic surveys around the Sphinx. They sent sound waves into the bedrock and mapped how deep the weathering extended below the surface. What they found was published in the peer-reviewed journal Archaeology. The subsurface weathering on the front, north, and south sides of the Sphinx enclosure extended 6 to 8 feet deep. But on the western end, the rear of the Sphinx, the weathering extended only 4 feet. This is not uniform. That non-uniformity is the smoking gun. Think of it this way. If you pour water on a sidewalk and come back later, the part that has been wet longest will show the most deterioration. The front and sides of the Sphinx enclosure have twice the weathering depth of the rear. Shock's interpretation is that the front and sides were carved first, thousands of years before the rear was completed, possibly during the Old Kingdom. It is like finding a house where the front wall has been standing in the rain for 7,000 years, but the back wall has only been there for 4,500. The back of the Sphinx is the receipt. It gives you the timeline. Assuming a conservative linear rate of weathering, Shock estimated the original carving of the Sphinx to date to between 5,000 and 7,000 BCE. But weathering rates are not linear. They slow down as the rock deepens. If you account for that deceleration, the Sphinx could be significantly older, potentially dating to around 10,000 BCE or beyond. Using multiple weathering rate models, both linear and nonlinear, the minimum age consistent with the seismic data is at least 7,000 years. The models most consistent with all the evidence cluster around 9,000 to 10,000 BCE. That is not 500 years before the textbooks say. That is 7,000 years before the textbooks say. That is the difference between the moon landing and the invention of the wheel. An entirely different chapter of human history. During those same seismic surveys, something else appeared in the data. A clear anomaly beneath the left paw of the Sphinx, a cavity, something down there that does not match the solid bedrock surrounding it. The data also suggested a possible tunnel-like feature running along the length of the body. These anomalies have never been fully investigated. The Egyptian authorities have not permitted excavation beneath the paws. Whatever is down there remains unknown. Now pay attention to this next detail. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and it will change how you look at every photograph of the Sphinx for the rest of your life. The head is too small for the body. This is not a matter of opinion. The body was carved at a ratio of 22:1. The head was carved at 30:1. It is visibly, measurably wrong. Even mainstream defenders of the conventional date acknowledge the proportional discrepancy. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with correct proportions. They nailed the proportions on every other colossal statue they ever built. Imagine discovering that someone had bolted a steering wheel from a golf cart onto a sports car. You would immediately know it was not original. That is the Sphinx's head. The body is far more eroded and weathered than the head. If they were carved at the same time from the same stone, they should show similar deterioration. They do not. The head is remarkably well preserved compared to the heavily eroded body. The most logical explanation is that the original head, whatever it depicted, eroded over thousands of years. Then, during dynastic times, a pharaoh had it recarved. Each recarving made the head smaller. What remains is a dynastic face grafted onto a body that is thousands of years older. Schoch's research suggests the original head may have been that of a lioness, or a full lion, proportionate to the massive body. A colossal stone lion crouching on the plateau, staring due east. Which brings us to the sky. The Sphinx faces precisely due east. On the morning of the spring equinox, it stares directly at the point where the sun rises. But behind the sun, the stars shift over time because of something called the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth wobbles as it spins, like a top that is slowing down. This wobble completes one full cycle every roughly 26,000 years, and because of it, the constellation that rises behind the sunrise on the spring equinox changes over millennia. Each age lasts about 2,160 years. Right now we are in the age of Pisces. When you map the precession backward to 2500 BCE, the conventional date for the Sphinx, the constellation rising east of the Sphinx, was Taurus the bull, not Leo the lion. A lion monument facing Taurus makes no symbolic sense. Ancient Egyptians were precise about symbolism. But when you dial the clock back to approximately 10,500 BCE, the constellation rising directly east of the Sphinx, exactly where the stone lion gazes, was Leo. The celestial lion was looking at the stone lion. The sky was a mirror of the ground. A 2025 research paper using NASA's JPL Horizon system and sky modeling software Stellarium went further still. Researchers found that Regulus, the brightest star in Leo, known since antiquity as the heart of the lion, achieved a precise 90-degree azimuth alignment at Giza, rising exactly due east, around 9,500 to 9,000 BCE. The Sphinx was not just facing the constellation Leo. It was staring directly at the heart of the celestial lion at the exact point on the horizon where Regulus broke the dawn. Three completely independent scientific disciplines now converge on the same approximate time frame. Geology says the Sphinx was exposed to rainfall that ended thousands of years before the pharaohs. Seismology says the subsurface weathering is consistent with an age far exceeding 4,500 years. Astronomy says the monument's form and orientation make symbolic sense only around 10,000 BCE. The probability of three independent datasets converging on the same approximate time frame by pure coincidence is the question serious researchers have asked for decades. The convergence across this many independent variables is, at minimum, a signal demanding investigation rather than dismissal. If the Sphinx was built around 10,000 BCE, it was built during one of the most dramatic periods in the history of our planet. Around 10,800 BCE, something catastrophic happened. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which has gained substantial scientific support over the past 2 decades, proposes that fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the northern hemisphere. The estimated energy release was equivalent to roughly 1 million Hiroshima bombs. The evidence spans at least 3 continents. Greenland ice cores show a massive platinum spike, a metal rare in Earth's crust but common in comets, precisely at the onset of the Younger Dryas. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds formed only under the extreme pressure and heat of a cosmic impact, appear in sediment layers across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Iridium-enriched magnetic spherules appear in the same boundary layer. Global temperatures plummeted by as much as 14 degrees Fahrenheit almost overnight. A mini ice age gripped the planet for 1,300 years. Massive wildfires swept continents. Dozens of megafauna species vanished: the woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger, the giant ground sloth, the American horse. And then there is Göbekli Tepe. In southeastern Turkey, buried under an artificial hill of rubble and soil, archaeologists have uncovered the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some over 16 feet tall and weighing up to 20 tons, were carved and erected around 9,000 BCE, 6,000 years before Stonehenge and 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid. There is more time between the builders of Göbekli Tepe and the builders of the pyramids than between the pyramids and your phone. The site was not a village. There are no houses, no kitchens, no storage rooms. It appears to be a temple or observatory, built by people who were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers without agriculture, without writing, without metal tools. And yet they organized the labor to quarry, carve, transport, and erect multi-ton stone pillars covered in intricate animal reliefs. Then around 8000 BCE, they deliberately buried the entire complex under hundreds of tons of fill. They preserved it on purpose. They wanted it to survive. One pillar, known as Pillar 43, or the Vulture Stone, is covered in animal carvings that researchers from the University of Edinburgh matched to star constellations using astronomical software. When they ran the star pattern match against historical sky charts, the computer returned a date of 10,950 BCE, plus or minus 250 years. The Greenland ice core date for the beginning of the Younger Dryas is approximately 10,870 BCE. The match is extraordinary. The builders of Göbekli Tepe appear to have encoded a memorial to the catastrophe using constellations, which means they understood the stars well enough to record a specific date in stone that a computer could decode 12,000 years later. That is not primitive. That is sophisticated astronomical knowledge that mainstream archaeology says should not exist for another 8,000 years. Both the Sphinx at Giza and Göbekli Tepe in Turkey show precise astronomical alignments. Researchers found that Regulus achieves an identical 90-degree azimuth alignment from both sites during the same epoch. Two monuments separated by over 1,000 miles, aligned to the same star at the same date. The implication is that these sites may be products of the same knowledge tradition, a system of astronomical precision that spanned the ancient world before the comet came. And then dynastic Egypt appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, around 3100 BCE. It arrived with a fully developed writing system, advanced mathematics, monumental architecture, and complex astronomical knowledge. There is no gradual development visible in the archaeological record. No clumsy first attempts. No failed prototypes. It appears almost instantaneously, as if someone handed them the answer key. What if that is because the foundations were laid thousands of years earlier, by the same culture that carved the Sphinx? The technology we documented in the quarries of Aswan, the dolerite pounders, the bow drills, the abrasive slurries, the water-lubricated sledges, that technology was real, refined, and remarkable. The craftsmen who built the king's chamber and carved the obelisks at Karnak were genuine masters. Their work endures across 5,000 years with joints still measured in fractions of a millimeter, hieroglyphs still crisp and legible under desert sun. But what if they were not the inventors? What if the pharaohs were the inheritors? What if ancient Egypt was not the beginning of the story, but the epilogue to one we have forgotten? This reframing changes nothing about the achievement. The builders who moved granite from Aswan to Giza, who ground the king's chamber to tolerances a modern machinist would respect, who organized thousands of workers into precisely calibrated teams, they were extraordinary. The evidence for their methods is physical, documented, and reproducible under experimental conditions. But the Sphinx, older than they are, eroded in ways their own monuments are not, aligned to a sky that was different when it was built. The Sphinx points backward to a chapter those pharaohs did not write. The conventional explanation for the Sphinx requires a remarkable number of simultaneous coincidences. It requires geology to be wrong about the water erosion pattern. It requires seismology to be misleading about the subsurface weathering differential. It requires the astronomical alignment to be meaningless. It requires the proportional anomalies to be a mistake by a civilization that made no such mistakes on any other monument. It requires the granite refacing of the Sphinx temple to be arbitrary. It requires the absence of any inscription naming the builder to be unremarkable. Each of these can be explained away individually. Together, they present a different picture. The most parsimonious explanation, the one requiring the fewest separate coincidences, is that the Sphinx body was carved thousands of years before dynastic Egypt, during the period when North Africa was a green savanna crossed by rivers that no longer exist. Dynastic Egyptians later recarved the head, built the pyramids nearby, refaced the deteriorating temples with expensive granite, and claimed the site as their own. This scenario explains the erosion. It explains the proportions. It explains the temple refacing. It explains the seismic non-uniformity. And it explains why no pharaoh's inscription claims the monument, because it predated the pharaohs who would have claimed it. A further possibility, supported by the convergence with Göbekli Tepe and the astronomical alignments, is that a sophisticated civilization existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, building monuments aligned to astronomical markers across multiple sites, encoding knowledge in the most permanent material available. A comet impact around 10,800 BCE shattered this civilization. Survivors seeded the cultures that later became ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and others. The Sphinx and Göbekli Tepe are remnants of this lost chapter. This explanation accounts for the fewest contradictions across the most evidence. But it requires accepting that established chronology is fundamentally incomplete, and that is a demand that institutions built on that chronology are not inclined to welcome. Paper burns. Wood rots. Memory fades within 3 generations. But stone endures. The ancient Egyptians understood this with a clarity we have lost. They built for epochs, not for lifetimes. The king's chamber still resonates. The obelisk hieroglyphs are still legible. And the Sphinx, whatever its true age, whatever its original face, is still there, still facing east, still waiting for someone to read what it was built to say. The honest answer to the question of how ancient Egyptians cut granite is that they did it through mastery, through generations of accumulated knowledge, refined techniques, organized labor, and a relationship with stone that was intimate, practical, and extraordinarily sophisticated. There is no mystery in their method that requires anything beyond human ingenuity applied patiently and brilliantly over time. But the honest answer to the question of who built the Sphinx, and when, is different. It is, we do not know with certainty. And the evidence that has accumulated across 4 independent scientific disciplines suggests strongly that the conventional answer is incomplete at best and wrong at worst. These 2 answers are not in conflict. They point to different things. One points to what the ancient Egyptians achieved with their hands and their knowledge. The other points to what may have come before, a tradition of astronomical precision, monumental ambition, and encoded knowledge that the pharaohs inherited, built upon, and carried forward, even if they did not originate it. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan is the receipt for one story. The workers knew exactly what they were doing. They had the technology, the expertise, and the organizational capacity to quarry 1,200 tons of pink granite from bedrock and shape it into a monument that would stand for millennia. They stopped because the stone had a flaw, not because the task exceeded them. The Sphinx, buried to its neck in sand for an estimated 3,300 of the last 4,500 years, is the receipt for another story. A story that the geological record insists is older than we have been told. A story that the seismic record supports. A story that the astronomical alignments corroborate. A story that the proportional evidence is consistent with. A story that the absence of any dedicatory inscription leaves stubbornly open. We have been looking at the complete Sphinx for less than 90 years. The first full modern excavation was completed in 1936. For the previous 4,400 years of recorded human history, the evidence, the water-eroded body, the mismatched proportions, the seismic cavities, was literally buried under sand. The stone has been waiting. 3 tunnels have been documented within the Sphinx itself. A seismically detected cavity exists beneath the left paw. Recent satellite radar scans have suggested the possibility of large chambers deep beneath the plateau. Whether these represent natural geological features or something more significant remains unknown, because full, unrestricted investigation has never been permitted. Whatever lies beneath the Sphinx, the monument above ground already tells a story that 4 independent scientific disciplines refuse to contradict each other about. Geology, seismology, astronomy, proportional analysis. 4 disciplines. 1 convergence. The Sphinx is older than the textbooks say. The question that remains, and that may be answered only if the stone beneath it is finally allowed to speak, is how much older. Who were the people who first looked at the bedrock of the Giza Plateau and saw what was inside it? What did they know about the stars, the stone, the water, and the slow turning of the earth? What other monuments did they leave that we have misattributed, misread, or not yet found? And here is the question that ought to stay with you when this is over. If a civilization sophisticated enough to carve the largest monolithic sculpture on Earth and align it to the heart of a constellation was erased so completely that we forgot it ever existed for 12 millennia, what does that say about the permanence of ours? We think our civilization is permanent. We think the internet remembers everything. But a comet does not care about your cloud storage. An ice age does not respect your infrastructure. And 12,000 years from now, what will remain of us? Probably less than the Sphinx. Because we build with steel and glass and concrete and code. They built with stone. And stone endures. The ancient Egyptians who quarried pink granite at Aswan and dragged it 900 kilometers to fit it into a chamber with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, they were saying something in the most durable language they could find. They were saying, "We knew how." And the builders of the Sphinx, whoever they were, building in an age of green savanna and a sky full of Leo, aligned a 200,000-ton monument to the heart of a celestial lion. They were also saying something. Something encoded in water erosion and seismic profiles and astronomical software that can still decode it today. They were saying, "We were here." Both messages are carved in stone. Both have survived ice ages and desert centuries and the long erosion of human memory. Now, for the first time in a very long time, we are learning to read them.